Hi, this is Bill, and welcome to Progpaganda. In this episode, we continue to count down our list of 25 albums released in the late 1960s that helped to influence and shape the genre of music that has come to be known as progressive rock. In an earlier episode, we identified the full list of 25 albums, as well as the criteria that we used to select them. If you haven't seen that episode yet, please check that out. That episode is at this link. There are also several episodes that we have done to date on various albums on the list from 1965, 66, and 67 that I hope you'll find interesting. The subject of today's episode is the great debut album by the New York area rock band Vanilla Fudge, produced by George Shadow Morton and released in 1967. I'm sure that some of you are hearing Vanilla Fudge and thinking to yourself, this band was a covers band and they were a one-hit wonder at that. Why are they deserving to be on this list? I would, quite frankly, not agree with your opinion on that if that's what you're thinking. This band were exceptionally influential, although perhaps not necessarily for the reasons you might think. In order to put that comment in perspective, let me go over a little bit of their history. Vanilla Fudge was initially formed as the Electric Pigeons in the latter part of 1966. All four of the members of the band, keyboard player and vocalist Mark Stein, bassist and vocalist Tim Bogart, guitar player Vince Martell, and drummer and vocalist Carmine Appice, born Carmine Appice. He anglicized his name, a choice that his younger brother Vinny would not make when he entered the music business a few years later. All four of the members of the band were exceptionally talented musicians. They had been playing in and around New York City, New Jersey, and Long Island for a number of years. Several of them had played together in different band configurations, ultimately before landing as the Electric Pigeons in late 1966. The Electric Pigeons would eventually shorten their name to the Pigeons, and ultimately, once they got a recording contract, to Vanilla Fudge, but that happens a few months from where we're discussing now. Vanilla Fudge were very well known on the rock scene in late 1966 and in 1967 around the New York area. One of the things that drew attention to them was their use of the Hammond organ as part of their instrumental repertoire. The Hammond organ wasn't a brand new instrument in 1966. It was seeing regular use by jazz musicians like Jimmy Smith and brother Jack McDuff going back to the 50s. And by the early 60s, various rock and roll musicians and bands, including, among others, Booker T. Jones, Ian McLaughlin of Small Faces, and Matthew Fisher of Procol Harum, were making use of the Hammond. The Hammond caught Mark Stein's attention largely because a friend of his in another area band, Felix Cavalieri of the Young Rascals, was using a Hammond on stage. And Stein loved the sound of it, and despite the fact that the band was not exactly flush financially in late 1966, they made the investment to put a Hammond on stage for Stein to play to make the band stand out. And it was definitely one of the things that drew attention to them. Their manager at this time was Phil Basile, who, in addition to managing the band, also provided them regular places to play. Basile owned several clubs in Long Island, including a very notable club of the time called the Action House. He also was a formidable character on the music scene. Basile was alleged to be a member of the Lucchese crime family, and so he was someone that people did not trifle with. By virtue of Basili's ownership of multiple clubs and associations with bands, he had a significant number of contacts in the music business and at various recording studios. And by early 1967, was working with the Pigeons to make demos to shop the band to potential record labels, to land them a record deal. One of those studios would be the studio where Vanilla Fudge's first album, and in fact several of their early albums, was recorded at, the studio Ultrasonic Studios in Hempstead, Long Island. It was probably at Ultrasonic where the members of then the Pigeons met the producer of Vanilla Fudge's first album, George Shadow Morton. Shadow Morton was a well-established figure in the music business by 1967. He had been in the business at that time for about 5 years or so. He had initially established himself both as a producer and as a songwriter through his work with the early 60s girl group, the Shangri-Las. Their songs Leader of the Pack and Remember Walking in the Sand were written by Morton and produced by him for the Redbird Records label. More recently, in this time frame, Morton had produced Janis Ian's first album, including her breakthrough hit about an interracial teenage romance called Society's Child. And through that record in particular, Morton had built contacts at Atlantic Records, who had originally planned to release Society's Child until they ultimately backed away from the single due to its then controversial content. Ultimately, Basili and Morton were able to place Vanilla Fudge at Atlantic Records. That happened in April of 1967. As a condition of the contract, Atlantic insisted that the band change their name. And based on a suggestion of a waitress at a club that the band played at, they opted to call themselves Vanilla Fudge, which was a reference to the blue-eyed soul music and soul covers that the band often played at the time. Vanilla Fudge's first album was made during April and May of 1967. One of the things that was realized fairly quickly during the sessions was that the band didn't have a lot of good original material at that time to work with. They were largely playing covers in the clubs and would need to spend a fair amount of time writing and honing down songs to get an album out. Atlantic didn't want to wait that long, and neither did Shadow Morton. Ultimately, the decision was made that cover versions of well-known songs would form the basis of the album. It was not uncommon for rock bands to include cover versions of other artists' songs on their albums in the middle 1960s. It was, however, unusual for a band to include nothing but covers on an album. And so, in order to differentiate themselves, Morton and the band made the choice of completely reworking the various songs that they included in the album. The arrangements of the songs they selected for the album are significantly different from the originals. Most are at least 2 to 3 minutes longer than their originals, some still longer than that. Most of them are very gothic in approach, leveraging the Hammond organ to maximum effect. One of the things that is also interesting and unique about the band's album for its time is that both the bass and percussion are turned fairly well up in the mix. If anything, the guitar is probably the least pronounced sound that you hear on the album, at least in its early masters. The band showed good taste in selecting songs for the album. Among the songs that appeared in the album were 2 Beatles numbers, Ticket to Ride and Eleanor Rigby. The album also includes a version of She's Not There by the Zombies, a keyboard-based tune that features Mark Stein on keyboards, as well as a great bass solo by Tim Bogart. It includes a wonderful version of the tune by Curtis Mayfield and the Impressions, People Get Ready, which features largely the band's vocal skills. But the song that, of course, everyone knows from the album is Vanilla Fudge's cover of the Supremes tune, which was a big hit for the Supremes in the fall of 1966, You Keep Me Hanging On. You Keep Me Hanging On is a powerhouse between its use of organ, use of not only Mark Stein's skills as a lead singer, but of Bogart's and Apice's skills as background singers. It is a wonderfully produced and wonderfully performed piece of music. You Keep Me Hanging On's total length on the album was nearly 7 minutes. It was obviously the choice for a single, but it had to be edited. It got edited down to just under 3 minutes for initial release as a single by the band in June 1967. The single quickly fell off the charts. But an interesting phenomenon occurred. Over the course of the summer of 1967, interest of the album began to spread, and it spread big, to the point where by September of 1967, Vanilla Fudge's first album had reached number 6 on the Billboard charts. Seeing the album's success, Atlantic re-released the single of You Keep Me Hanging On. This time, the single was a hit in its own right, and it also reached number 6 on the charts. Vasily, Morton, and Atlantic Records took advantage of these circumstances and did everything they could to build the band's reputation, ultimately landing the band a gig on The Ed Sullivan Show in January of 1968, and multiple appearances on television on various of the syndicated talk shows of the day. Shows like The Mike Douglas Show, The Merv Griffin Show, also featured Fudge playing You Keep Me Hanging On and other songs in their repertoire for the time. They had made it, and they had made it big, and they made it with a covers album of all things. Obviously, the covers were reworked, they were unique in their own right, but they were covers. This is probably something that had never happened for a rock and roll band before. Vanilla Fudge would continue their success throughout the 1960s. They never had a hit single like You Keep Me Hanging On again, although some of their singles were quite memorable. Their song Thoughts, one that was an original from the band, written by Vince Martell from their third album, Renaissance, is an excellent piece of music. Over the course of the band's remaining tenure, they would continue to write songs and ultimately would pepper their albums with a mix of covers and songs that, in their eyes at least, tended to work. And it wasn't just in their eyes. The public continued to buy their albums beyond the debut. Again, none of Fudge's subsequent albums reached the heights of their first, but The Beat Goes On, their second album, reached number 17. Renaissance, their third album, reached number 20. Near the Beginning, their fourth album, reached number 17. And their last album from their original incarnation, Rock and Roll, reached number 34. So this was a band that had a regular presence on the charts for about 2.5 to 3 years. People were buying their records, they were getting radio airplay, and they were getting placements in the clubs and on television. They were very influential by virtue of this presence on the charts. John Lord, the English musician who ultimately founded Deep Purple with Ritchie Blackmore, heard Vanilla Fudge's early work and basically decided then and there that he wanted to ditch his then current band, the Flower Pot Men, and follow the path of Vanilla Fudge. At one point, he was even quoted in an interview saying, that he wanted Deep Purple to be a Vanilla Fudge clone in the early days. And that is certainly something that you can see in the content of Deep Purple's albums, which, like Fudge's albums, were a mix of well-placed covers as well as original material. The band also got the attention of Jeff Beck, who by 1968 was with his original incarnation of the Jeff Beck Group with Rod Stewart and Ronnie Wood doing a fair amount of cover material as well. Ultimately, Beck connected with Bogart and Appice and expressed interest in founding a new band with them, which didn't happen quite the way it was planned. The initial intent was that that band would begin work in early 1970 following the tour for Vanilla Fudge's album Rock and Roll and the completion of Vanilla Fudge's contract with Atlantic. It didn't turn out that way. Jeff Beck was severely injured in an auto accident in late 1969, ultimately leaving Bogart and Appice to strike out on their own from Vanilla Fudge, which they did with the band Cactus. Cactus was popular in its own right for several years in the early 1970s, with ultimately Beck, Bogart, and Appice joining forces in 1973 to create their self-titled album, as well as a live album recorded in Japan. Although the original incarnation of Vanilla Fudge ended in early 1970, the band would return from time to time in various incarnations, beginning in the early 1980s, and continues to exist to this day. Tim Bogart retired from public performance in 2010 and unfortunately passed away in 2021. But the three remaining original members, along with bassist Pete Bremy, continue to work on an occasional basis, particularly in the New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia area. In addition, the various members of the band have their own projects that they pursue on the side. It's not uncommon to see either Pete Bremy or Vince Martell performing with their bands in South Jersey or in Philadelphia, even to today. This was a band that had a tremendous impact, despite the one-hit wonder status that a lot of people attached to them. So just to summarize why this band is so important to progressive rock, they were virtuosos. All four of the members of Vanilla Fudge were terrific musicians and really could have played with anybody. And over the course of the 1970s and 80s, Bogart and Appice in particular played multiple gigs with various bands. But the thing that probably made the biggest impact to prog rock, for which we can thank Vanilla Fudge, is that they were able to sell their first album largely without the benefit of a single to support it. With one exception, all of the songs on Vanilla Fudge's first album are 5 minutes in length or more, which didn't translate to hit singles, certainly. Hit singles were, in 1967, expected to be no more than 3 minutes, maybe a little bit more. And bands were discouraged from breaking that rule. So this was not an album that, with the initial failure of the edited version of You Keep Me Hanging On, I suspect that Atlantic had very much hope for being able to do anything in the marketplace. But here was a band who did unique versions of cover songs and were able to take it and ride it to number 6. This was not something that had ever happened before. And it made a difference, in particular to prog rock, in the sense that people recognized, not only people in bands, but record company executives recognized that pop music records could be successful without the benefit of a single to ride along with them. Singles certainly helped, but probably as much as any album from 1967, Vanilla Fudge's debut proved that exceptions to the rule did make sense now, that rock bands could sell albums based on album content without singles having to do the heavy lifting. And that was something that absolutely mattered, particularly to bands like King Crimson, Yes, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer in 1969 and 1970, whose songs generally were much longer than would have been friendly for singles release. So that's the story of Vanilla Fudge. I hope you enjoyed it. We have more to cover from our list going forward. Our next episode will be an interesting one. It's the story of Pink Floyd's The Piper at the Gates of Dawn with Syd Barrett. Please come back and join us for that one soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.